Welcome to another Zeteo Town Hall for paid subscribers. I'm Mehdi Hasan. We're talking about Syria today, an issue that has grabbed global headlines again after several years in which we'd stopped thinking about Syria, a lot of us in the West, because we thought it was a frozen conflict, and yet the conflict is back with a vengeance. Syrian opposition groups, fighters, rebels, Islamists, we're going to get into what we call them, have taken over Aleppo, Syria's second biggest city, made huge gains in Idlib, and the Assad regime is on the defensive. There's much to discuss. The world's eyes are now back on Syria after spending the last few months on Lebanon and, of course, Gaza. How much has all of that played into this? What's the role of outside parties? Who are these rebels? What is Assad's future? So many questions to ask. We thought it'd be great to have Hassan Hassan join us, who's here on this town hall with us. He's a Syrian-American journalist, editor of New Lines magazine, has written about Syria for many, many years and about Islamist groups and Assad in the Middle East, is the author of the New York Times bestseller, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. Hassan, thanks so much for joining us on this Zeteo Town Hall.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Mehdi. Thanks.
So we've got questions coming in the chat. There's already over 100 people in this conversation. I urge you all to put your questions in the chat. I'll try and ask as many as I can. But while we wait for questions to get going, I've got many of my own. You'll be shocked to hear, Hassan. Let's start with the obvious one. Why now? Where did this suddenly come from? End of 2024, for 4 years, no real movement on the ground in terms of fighting. For about 7, 8 years, hasn't really been in the headlines in the West. Why now?
So nobody knows exactly. I mean, nobody expected this to happen. I think it surprised everybody, including probably the rebels themselves. They charged into Aleppo. So according to the conversation I've been having with people on the ground, it seems the first or the initial goal was basically to kind of go into Aleppo and start fighting the regime there, rather than within a day or two, or within 72 hours, essentially, you take over the second largest city in Aleppo and much of the province around it, which is the largest province in Syria, and then move very quickly down south into central Syria, Hama, and other critical areas where you start getting into the Assad regime heartlands, the Alawite heartlands. So it was something that basically the rebels achieved in 4 days, what they couldn't achieve in a decade before that.
And we're almost a week in now. You mentioned the first 4 days. I think it was last Wednesday where this all kicked off. Thursday, Wednesday. Where are we right now as we speak on a Tuesday evening here in the United States? What is the situation on the ground right now, as far as you understand?
So the momentum slowed down over the past 48 hours, maybe for like even less. Initially, they took over Aleppo city and started moving very quickly all the way to Hama. Even I think they entered the city of Hama, and then they stopped. They couldn't, because the regime started pushing back, and not really pushing back, but like start sending reinforcement. Today, they started kind of getting closer to Hama again, so they started moving as well, and we started to also see movements against the Assad regime in different parts of the country, in Deir ez-Zor, along the Iraqi borders, for example, also between Damascus and Lebanon on that way, Kalamoun Mountains. So basically, other than the big takeover in the beginning, fighting continues, or advances, rebel advances, not really fighting, but it's slower than before.
So you mentioned Lebanon. We've got a question about Lebanon. And those of you just joining now, this is the Zeteo Town Hall on Syria, on the breaking news out of Syria. What is going on in Syria? Who are these rebels? What are the prospects for Assad and his regime? What is the role of outside powers? A lot of questions to ask Hassan Hassan, our guest, Syrian-American journalist, analyst, about. Vanessa Vaughan, you mentioned Lebanon, Hassan, says in our chat, is it a coincidence, she asks, that this has happened, or are there links to the ceasefire in Lebanon, i.e. Hezbollah weapons coming into or out of Syria?
I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense of the rebels have been keeping an eye on what's happening to Hezbollah and Iran in the region, in the context of the war in Gaza. And they wanted to take advantage of this because they know the Assad regime is very weak, but also its key allies, whether you're talking about Hezbollah or Iranian militias that have been operating inside Syria, are basically on the run. They cannot operate as freely as they used to in Syria, back in the day in the 2014 and before and after, you would see convoys of Toyotas and other cars with militias from around the world, around the region. That kind of movement is now a no-go for Iranian militias because Israel would strike them inside Syria. Israel has been going after networks and the infrastructure of Iranian militias inside Syria for over a year now.
So I was going to bring this up later in the conversation, but since you mentioned Israel, let's just cut to the big question a lot of people are arguing about online. Every time I log into X or Blue Sky or whatever social platform you're on these days, people, especially in the pro-Palestinian movement, Hassan, you know this, are arguing about where does Israel factor into what's happening into Syria? Given what's happening in Gaza, it's a logical, natural question. There are some who say, they point to reporting saying Israel doesn't want Assad to fall. It's going to cause issues for Israel. Israeli intelligence reports are being leaked saying they're worried about Assad falling and the power vacuum. Others are saying, well, hold on, there's well-documented evidence that Israel supported a lot of these rebel groups back in the day, back in 2014, 15, 16. And actually, they're on the side of the rebels. Where does Israel figure into all of this, in your view?
So every time something happens, Syria, the same debates we're having. But it's a very good question. I think the Israeli position on Syria is like there are two sides of it, two layers. On one hand, they don't want the Assad regime to fall. This is almost a truism in Israeli politics, in Israeli anyone who knows anything about their position over the past 13 years in Syria. They don't want this the collapse of the Assad regime. Now, what does that mean? It means basically areas between Damascus, core areas that the Assad regime controls, the capital, Damascus, down to areas close to Daraa, Konaitra, near the Israeli borders. That is, they don't want jihadis or Islamists or any other devil they don't know. They like the Assad regime not because they like the regime itself, because they have come to understand. We can get more because the dynamics between the Assad regime and Israel over the past year, they're fascinating details. They're kind of surprised a lot of people, including supporters of the Assad regime. Now, the other side of it is that other than these parts, Israel supports the fact that they maybe cheer the rebel advances in the north eastern Syria. The reason why is because away from the capital Damascus, the Iranians have been building network and infrastructures, tunnels and everything in areas away from the Assad regime.
So it's an anti-Iran posture.
Exactly. So
because I remember interviewing Ephraim Halevi back in my Al Jazeera days up front, former head of Mossad, who said to me, yeah, we do support these groups because, they're different. We don't have an issue with Al-Qaeda, he said at the time. We have an issue with Hezbollah. We don't have an issue with Al-Qaeda. And there has been some documentation of Israel having supported some of these, even given hospital treatment to some of these jihadist fighters. But you're saying that's part of a wider strategy to kind of divide and rule Syria and undermine Iran, not to see Assad go at the end.
I mean, it makes sense, right? That you weaken the Assad regime by carving out, not you, as in like whether you're talking about Israel or others, in most of the country, along the Iraqi borders, elsewhere, because not doing that means that the Assad regime is too weak to control and consolidate control in those areas. So Iran would be operating in that kind of vacuum. The best way to understand Israel's position is it's a paradoxical one. It's a contradictory one. Other than these areas I mentioned, they're happy that the Assad regime is losing.
So we'll come back to all of the outside. We need to talk about Turkey, Iran, the US, and Russia, some of the outside powers. But before we do that, let's talk about the actual group at the heart of all of this. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was a kind of Al-Qaeda group, it comes out of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was an Al-Qaeda front in Syria for a while. It had ties to ISIS, even though it's since fought with ISIS. It's now saying it's much more pragmatic. People are saying it's not part of the quote-unquote global jihad. There's been a lot of commentary about this group in the last week, and its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. This is the group driving the quote unquote rebellion, if we can call it that. Basil Kiwan, one of our subscribers, asks you, Hassan, is there any possibility of political engagement with HTS and other opposition groups to encourage some degree of moderation? You know, and some of our subscribers may know, HTS is technically a prescribed banned terrorist group, according to the United States government.
So the history of it, I mean, the Americans know this. They know that this is a group that has basically the group's father is essentially Al-Qaeda, grandfather is ISIS, as in they moved through these two organizations. But I think everyone knows, anyone who's watching the Syrian conflict, that this organization has evolved. They have abandoned Al-Qaeda, not just abandoned Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they fought both, and they can be whether you like them or not, they have single-handedly eradicated Al-Qaeda in Syria because they fought it. They didn't want them to operate in northern Syria as competitors. Now, in terms of engagement, the interesting part about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is they model themselves on the Taliban rather than Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So they're not interested in global jihad, and they've been signaling to both countries in the region and in the West that all they want is not just to make peace and kind of just be left alone, but also to work with those countries diplomatically and to fight jihadists. Now, one of the co-founders of this group is someone I had before he was killed 6 months ago, been interviewing because he was operating my hometown, my birth town essentially, and up until 6 months he was one of the most senior members of the organization, co-founded in the group in Syria. And the way they talk about the organization is they have been criticizing, let's say, jihad and jihadism, especially international jihad. And this guy, when he was killed for very ironic reasons. That he was accused by ISIS that he was cooperating with the CIA, and that he was giving coordinates and locations for jihadists, not just Al-Qaeda, but also not only ISIS, but also Al-Qaeda, to target in Syria. This is more just more than a rumor. I think there are reports about how Hayat Tahrir al-Sham helped international coalition and others to strike against jihadists in Syria.
So I want to come back to the international coalition in a second. Just on something you mentioned, you said Afghanistan and Taliban is a model for them in a way. Now, clearly it's good that Al-Qaeda is not a model for them, if that's true, but the Taliban ain't the greatest of models. And when you say Taliban, that brings up what a lot of supporters of the Assad regime say, which is if this group is allowed to take over Syria, it will be like the Taliban. You'll have women oppressed, you'll have Christians persecuted, you'll have Shias, minority Muslim groups, targeted. Is that true right now? Is that the case?
It is true. It's true, and it's the biggest fear. Now, what some Syrians, okay, so if you talk to both Syrians on both sides, let's talk about the Syrian opposition. A lot of people are very cautiously optimistic about what's happening, only because it's this group that's leading the charge. Now, on one hand, they know that this organization has moderated itself over time. They have gone out of the way to basically signal that they are even sometimes more moderate than other nationalist forces in northern Syria. They have, for example, the leader Abu Muhammad al-Julani. He went to areas. One of the areas where his group controls, under his control, and he met with Druze leaders, and he said something that would have been considered apostasy a few years ago by his own group, which is that you Druze are part of us. Now, this is if you like, any religious person would see this as Druze. I mean, you can say that maybe about Christians, the people of the book, but Druze are considered to be Batini, kind of one of those kind of groups, not even mainstream Shia, but like, what I mean? So they would consider this heretical in those circles, not jihadists.
So you're saying that's evidence of them at least signaling moderation, even if they're not moderate, they're doing the PR game.
Yeah, to me, I think it's somewhere between. They're still obviously bad guys in the sense that they're radicals, but I don't think they're as simply a kind of as being portrayed in some circles, that they're just simply jihadists. They are trying to be pragmatic, and I think they're more Syrian than as in the best way to understand them is that way. So
just on that, Rami Sajdari, sorry if I'm butchering names here, apologies to our subscribers. Rami asks, are these rebels in HTS native Syrians, or are there non-native elements involved? We've known about foreign jihadists, quote unquote, for many years. There's been reports I've seen on social media, people claiming there's a Uyghur group fighting in there as well. What is the relationship between foreigners and Syrians right now in the current moment?
There's a minority of jihadists and Islamists in Syria, a small minority. Before 2013, the majority of this group were foreign jihadists, but most of them, almost all of them, went and joined ISIS. So Jabhat al-Nusra remained largely dominated by Syrians.
You mentioned HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, being accused of working with the CIA and the US government. You're saying there might be some truth that they did work with them to target ISIS. A lot of people, I don't know what to call them without being pejorative, let's try and keep it as neutral as possible. Some, I don't even know the word. I don't want to say left because the left is a broad faction, but there are some critics of the US government online, supporters of the Assad government, who say these are just CIA proxies. This is another regime change war. They point to undeniably true things that happened in the past, like Operation Timber Sycamore, where the CIA did fund Syrian extremist groups to try and topple Assad. And they say, look, this is just the CIA doing the same thing again. Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, came out on the weekend and basically acted like he wasn't a fan of these groups, and that the US government's position right now under Biden is for Assad to stay in power. Kaleem Kambodge, one of our subscribers, asks you, who are the proxies here? Is this a US-Russia conflict? How is Iran involved? How much of this is a proxy war?
So this one is another multi-layered, question. The answer to it is more complex than it seems. I think it's mostly, I would say, maybe 70% of the situation is Syrian-led.
Okay.
We have to always, I think this is led by Syrians. They wanted to do this. They have been wanting to do this. Now, having agency doesn't mean you don't have backers. And in this case, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other groups, especially the Syrian National Army, which operates alongside it, which is a coalition of other local groups, they're backed by Turkey. And Turkey has been their protector. When Russia would bomb them and try to take some areas, Turkey would coordinate politically with Russia, or sometimes
So just to jump in, Michael Bergmeyer, one of our subscribers, asked, who is supplying the rebels with weapons and money? You're saying it's Turkey. They're the primary state sponsor of this group?
I think they're largely self-funded, but there's a group within the coalition, which is what we call the Syrian National Army. This is more directly supported by Turkey. I think
what's Turkey's interests? What's Erdogan's interest?
So Turkey is very interested in the north to secure northwestern Syria and northeastern Syria. This is central to their quarrel, for example, with the United States, where they didn't want the Kurds to be protected by the United States to fight ISIS in northeastern Syria. So they've been with the tension with almost every administration since, with the Biden administration, with the Obama administration before, working with the Kurds. So Turkey wanted to basically secure its southern borders.
Michael Eisenshaw, on that note, just sorry to jump in, says it appears the Kurds are being squeezed from every direction. Michael asks, in light of the current developments, what are their prospects? Do they have any allies in the region?
The Syrian rebels?
No, the Kurds.
Oh, the Kurds, yeah. So the Kurds are in a very bad dilemma now, because they are Turkey wants to go and take over their areas in northeastern Syria. Kind of in the lead up to this operation, there had been some discussions between the Assad regime and Turkey via Russia to reach an agreement between Turkey and the Assad regime, where Turkey would normalize relations with the Assad regime in exchange for, kind of having a formal agreement where Turkey can operate in Syria within a certain, kind of with 22 miles within Syria. And part of it is to also go after the Kurds in northeastern Syria, to work together with the Assad regime, Turkey and the Assad regime, and allow the Assad regime to take over eastern Syria in exchange for basically eradicating the Kurdish presence in eastern Syria. Another issue is the timing, and I think timing also is relevant to the Trump administration, the timing of the operation, because Turkey wants to reshuffle things in eastern Syria in preparation that Trump, again, with a call with Erdogan, would just tell him to go ahead and take over Syria. I think the Turkish assessment is that the Trump administration, with figures, even like different factions within the upcoming Trump administration, like Rubio, for example, or J.D. Vance, who usually disagree, don't see eye to eye on many things, they seem to agree that Turkey can take over and take care of things in Syria, which means the Kurds are going to have a bad time there.
And the Kurds had a bad time under Trump, as you mentioned. And Rubio, of course, was one of the senators who criticized Donald Trump in 2019 for pulling troops out of Syria. There's still 900 US troops in Syria. They're not located anywhere near where the current fighting is going on. They haven't engaged in the current fighting. Quick question on the fighting. Deborah Cooper asks, were the Assad forces asleep?
I think the Assad, this is a really good question, because I don't think they were asleep. They were, their attention was somewhere else. Remember, this is mindset is crucial in such wars. The Assad regime's mindset, in my opinion, the Assad regime, maybe Bashar Assad himself, was somewhere else, completely the reverse of what happened over the past six days. The Assad regime was on the verge of normalizing with almost every country in the region. Turkey was about to normalize with Assad regime. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, other countries all sent ambassadors. And the Assad regime's mindset is, okay, so I emerged victorious in the war 4 years ago, and now every country wants to normalize with me. Turkey is still, we're talking about it. And suddenly, as he was shifting towards that kind of, his mind shifting towards that, something like this happens. So imagine that. I think the heaviest blow is not just that the rebels did this, but the whole trajectory that the Assad regime was basically going for is completely different. In Syria, we have a saying that the bite has reached the mouth, and I think you can kind of describe, you can kind of that capture the sense in Syria, not just the Syrian presidency and a government, but also people there. So I have been, for example, talking to people who are close to the Assad regime, or even like silent majority, what we call silent majority, who I don't think they don't want to recapture the Aleppo. They don't want to repeat the same scenarios. They've gone through this. They lived through what was supposed to be post-conflict peace, but that peace was without electricity, without food, without anything. So for them, the situation is the same. So they wanted now this to be an opportunity for transition of sorts rather than a renewal of the war.
Aubrey Harris asks, in terms of reactions, a couple of questions about Assad's reactions. One is from Aubrey Harris, who says, what is the risk of seeing Syria or Assad use chemical weapons again?
I don't, unless it's, I mean, we've reached a situation where the Assad regime can be so desperate that chemical weapons become a tactical necessity rather than because, he wants to just destroy people. A lot of this is because the rebels can reach a point where they can either enter Damascus or be. So
let me ask you that straight question. People have talked up, as you know, for years. He's on the verge of going. Assad's on the verge of being beaten, and it didn't happen. Are we exaggerating when we say there might be a chance that we see the end of Assad in the coming months?
I don't think so, because look, I think the Assad regime is so weak, too weak. Iran is unable to now go freely and defend Assad. Without Iran, the Assad regime cannot reclaim Aleppo or these parts of Syria. Russia is busy. But at the same time, the Assad regime has a core of core forces that can defend Damascus, can defend the Alawite areas. So at least some parts of Syria will remain under Assad control. And too many people, too many countries are invested in the survival of the Assad regime. So I don't think that's going to happen.
Stephen Moses asks, what is Bashar al-Assad's likely response to pressure from the UAE and the United States to distance from Iran? And why would Syria leave the axis of resistance as it's known?
So this has been in discussion for over a year. On the first day of the events in Gaza, on actually probably the next day after October 7, there was a call between the UAE and the Assad regime, the UAE and Russia and Israel, that we later kind of understood to be talking to Assad not to open the front between Syria and Israel, meaning the Golan Heights need to be completely quiet and non-violent. There's no basically fighting and clashing, and even allowing the Iranians to operate from there. And astonishingly, while the Hezbollah in Lebanon was burning and kind of being the front lines with Israel, the Houthis from afar, every proxy or ally, let's call them, of Iran has been engaged in the fight, except the Assad regime, which is actually surprising even more because Assad proximity
direct
to
neighbor.
Yeah. So Assad has been playing this game that, look, I can do what my dad did before or had done before, which is to keep this front between Israel and Syria quiet. And that has been his best selling point into the international community. Yes, Assad is bad, but at least he has not allowed him or his father a single bullet to be fired from the Golan Heights. So in that sense, he's playing a smart game, and that was in parallel to the normalization with the Arab countries and others. So he was signaling to Israel and to the United States that, look, I'm not troubled, but just allow me to live, essentially.
Ahmed Salem asks, is the writing on the wall when it comes to Russian support for Assad, given how stretched thin they are due to the war in Ukraine? And I would let me add to Ahmed's question, his two big allies were Russia and Iran. Russia stretched thin in Ukraine, as Ahmed says, and Iran, of course, dealing with direct military action with Israel for the first time in modern history, dealing with the Lebanon crisis. So is he stretched, is Russia and Iran both stretched too thin to come to his aid?
So Russia is stretched too thin. Iran is not. Iran can reverse the fortunes of the rebels if they are allowed to go into Syria without Israel attacking them. That's the simple reality of it. Iran has tens of thousands of militiamen that can go tomorrow to Syria and defend it. So that is exactly why I think the recapture of Aleppo is going to be difficult, because Russia does not have ground forces that can help Assad. Iran is the only one that can supply these ground forces. The worst that can happen for Aleppo is constant bombardment strikes by Russia until Aleppo is turned into basically rubble, and that's the best they could do. Other than like recapture street to street, I don't think that's possible.
In terms of support for Assad, Stefan Schmidt asks, what do you know about Iran sending Afghan Shia refugees to fight in Syria? And Mohammed Ragab asks, any truth to the news of Iraqi militias moving into Syria to fight with the Assad regime, alongside the Assad regime?
So far, all these are in the realm of rumors. The Iraqis denied it. There was some reports on social media. But so far, Iran, the latest statement from Iran is, we're willing to send troops if Assad asks us to. I think they have to find a work around it. I don't think Israel will allow this operation, because Israel is bombing Syria every day, every time they see Iran is there. So they have to find some other arrangement where maybe Iraqi troops or others who can go there without being Iraqi, Iranian militias, essentially, or being perceived as such.
So we talked about Iranian militias, Iraqi militias. On the other side, let's go back to the opposition forces. A couple of linked questions. Alexandra Tomei, I think is her last name, asks, what is left of the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, as the umbrella of armed opposition groups? They had liberated so much territory in 2015 until they got crushed by the Russian Air Force. And Kaleem Hussein asked, what's the approximate size of HTS fighters in comparison to other groups that are fighting in Syria currently?
So the FSA has always been an umbrella name for groups. So they still operate in northern Syria, if you understand kind of they're local fighters. So there are still Free Syrian Army. They call themselves different factions depending on where they operate. So FSA is still there, but the dominant force is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in northwestern Syria. This is something they've been working on for many years. Every time someone seems to be dominating, they go after them, Free Syrian Army, jihadists, whatever, until they dominate it. And they think that what happened in Aleppo is a result of this years-long strategy of basically making sure they dominate, so they can focus on the enemy rather than the enemy within, but like the real enemy in front of them. Their numbers, I don't think they announced their numbers, but I would say around 20,000. Maybe their kind of special forces and the strength, the core, will probably be around 10 to 12,000 jihadists.
Sahida Uddin says, why? She says she apologizes. She misses the beginning. She says, why now? Why are these rebel groups launching now? Isn't this going to make things worse for Gaza? And what is Turkey's position on Palestine now? How much of what's going on in Syria is connected or could be connected to Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran? It's hard for people who've been watching the last year and a half of genocide in Gaza to suddenly switch to Syria and not draw comparisons, analogies, connections, right?
So Syria has been happening before and after Gaza.
Yes.
So before the Syrian rebels in those areas were being bombed by the Russians and the Iranians, and killed by the Iranians and the Russians, the Assad regime, before Gaza happened. During Gaza, as in over the past year, more than a year, while Israel bombarding Gaza, the Assad regime, Russia, also were bombarding those civilian areas. Idlib, some of the scenes that come out of Syria were used to be kind of for Gaza. People thought like this is scenes from Gaza. So this is a key point to think that there's no contradiction between the two. I mean, there's Syria carnage and there's Gaza carnage. This was happening. This has happened. The problem is when, excuse the label, but like the far leftist or leftists who think that you can't somehow have a complicated moral position on this. You have to kind of condemn Assad and condemn Russians and Iranians, but at the same time maybe agree with them on their position against Israel. That's the problem. This is really the debate that a lot of Syrians are not like. Obviously, they're sympathetic with people in Gaza. Gazans sympathetic with Syrians. If you talk to normal people, but on social media, it's a completely different picture where you have somehow to take a position that's not nuanced. So, to answer the question,
Sorry, go on.
No, I'm just saying like. I don't think it doesn't affect because Syrians are fighting there. The Assad regime is not fighting Israel. So they can, the two things can be deconflicted and,
By the way, one thing you just reminded when you mentioned about Assad regime in Israel, and we mentioned Iraq earlier, there's also this debate about, there's a lot of simplistic framing, right? I know this from 10 years ago. I used to get attacked as being a supporter of the rebels and a supporter of Assad at the same time, simply because I condemned the bad guys on both sides. Not that I like the both sides framing. But what's interesting is Syria is always a place that's reduced to very simplistic. It's Al-Qaeda versus Assad. It's Israel versus Turkey. It's America versus Russia. One thing that bothers me is this idea, just talk about Assad's role as a secular leader. Because a lot of leftists who do sympathize with Assad say, well, look, he's a bulwark against jihadism. Do you really want HTS or Al-Qaeda running Syria? He's the secular leader. But my understanding is he's played the sectarian and religious cards when he's wanted to. He has released certain groups from prison at the right time. He, according to the Americans and according to the Iraqis, facilitated the transfer of jihadist fighters into Iraq in kind of 05, 06, 07, 08. So I'm just wondering where you stand, this whole secular versus Islamist imposition framework on Syria. How do you react to that?
So it depends. I think it's all a prism kind of lens kind of question. Do you see him as a secular, or do you see him as a dictator, or do you see him as an Alawite? So each one would have a same, it could be like, oh, this is an Alawite. That's why I cannot accept him as a president because he's he's not Sunni. And someone would say he's secular, he's not Islamist. That's why I would, So I would say the jihadists emerged in the first place because of these dictators in the region. They would not have existed before because of they existed because of wars, because of these dictators, and you can see a pattern. You don't see jihadists in Saudi Arabia despite religious background, or in Egypt and elsewhere. Jihadists exist where countries collapsed. In Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and it's not because the conflicts themselves, because of vacuum. Jihadists exist in those vacuums, and those vacuums are created by dictators, by failed governance that eventually lead people to rise up against them and or be invaded by outsiders. So I would say it depends on how people see it. I don't see Bashar Assad as a secular. He uses and utilizes religion as much as everyone else. Sisi in Egypt toppled an Islamist president, but he talks more Islamist, more like an Islamist than his predecessor who he toppled. So it's basically it's more or less the same. That's why I think these labels will, even jihadist, kind of describing Hayat Tahrir as jihadist, and that's the only label and lens you understand them through, is one thing that only will take you to one destination, which is you fight them, you continue fighting them, they continue coming back. The Taliban were defeated 20 years ago, and they came back stronger than before. So, it's just a cycle. I think the best way to see it is these are really radical Syrians, but they are Syrian. So we have to see how can we deal with them in that way, in that nuanced way.
Very well put. I think nuance is very important. This is why we wanted to speak to you today and have this town hall and ask these questions, because there's a lot of simplistic takes on social media, and this is a conflict which has been going on for a while, as you say, pre-Gaza, and does require some nuance. Ali Mouswi and Imad Hassan, don't know if you both joined late, asking about, is there collusion between Israeli leaders and anti-Assad forces? Imad Hassan asking, is there substance to the argument that Israel and the US don't really want Assad to be ousted? Is there concern the rebels will be a bigger threat to Israel? Quite funny, the kind of juxtaposition of those questions, which kind of sums up. Some people see Assad as on Israel's side. Some people see him as someone Israel's trying to topple. And as you mentioned earlier, Israel and America can play multiple games at once, as can every outside power.
Yeah, some of these kind of debates happening, taking place on social media, because people look and see scenes of Syrians from Idlib, distributing baklava and candy when Hezbollah's leader is killed by the Israelis, or whenever the Israeli attack those.
Yes.
Now, obviously, you have to understand the nuance of this. So they're not celebrating Israel or the killings, but they are, Hezbollah to them was the one force that slaughtered them, laughed at their carnage. There are scenes of Hezbollah journalists, quote unquote, who have footage of people in Madaya starving, like literally, at least the pictures and stuff like that. And he eats and he says, look, I have so much food, look at them, they don't have food, and that kind of. For Syrians, this is embedded in their view, much like the Palestinians are when it comes to the Israelis. So when they see Hezbollah being defeated and being killed, they celebrate, because they couldn't for 13 years. Hezbollah was basically killing them.
Hassan, are you so, and a lot of supporters of Assad or Hezbollah, a lot of Shia people would say they were there to fight jihadists, right? They were there to protect Shia holy sites, as you know the argument, against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or whatever HTS is now. Without wanting to get into all of that and re-prosecute all those arguments, I do want to ask you, because I'm worried about this, how worried are you about the rise of sectarianism once again in the Muslim majority world, in Muslim communities in the West? Kind of, if you're Shia, you have to support Assad. If you're Sunni, you have to support rebels, and lacking the nuance we just talked about a moment ago, and turning this into a sectarian conflict.
So I don't think sectarianism is rising. I mean, it was rising, you're right, like during ISIS and before. But I think we've seen a steady decline of sectarian discourse for many years since 2014. One is the demise of ISIS. The Shia discourse in Iraq has been conciliatory and very from Sistani, from Najaf and elsewhere. The Saudis abandoned that kind of. They cracked down on religious discourse that spewed sectarianism. So we've seen a lot of sectarian rhetoric and polarization decline over the past half, maybe a decade. And I think the Gaza war, with the involvement of Hezbollah and others, have also created this cross-sectarian discourse that there's solidarity for Palestinians. Now, in Syria,
although traditionally, interestingly, Hamas and Hezbollah took different views on Syria. Interesting.
Exactly. Syria is different because for Syrians still raw, they've been defeated after 13 years of war, and Hezbollah was one of the main forces that led to their defeat and their killings and so on and so forth. I also see that point where a lot of Shia who look at the Syrian jihadists and remember, people forget, people downplay the power of communal memory. When the Alawites in Syria, for example, when the war started, they immediately remembered as a collective, trauma from the past, the Ottomans, killings and carnage and oppression. These things, astonishingly, people think like, oh, ordinary people don't remember these things. But actually, when you interact with people, you started to see people somehow, I don't know, like the science of it, but people remember certain trauma. They react in a certain way where these are neo-Ottomans. They're coming to kill us. We have to defend the regime because that's the only way to survive. Now, that doesn't excuse the carnage and everything, but that's the reality of humanity.
So last question, as we're almost out of time. We're in the US. You're in Washington, D.C. Let's talk about the US role here. The Biden administration was silent at first. Then Jake Sullivan came out and made almost pro-Assad noises at the weekend, which is weird because the Obama administration did spend a lot of money trying to topple Assad, undeniably. So that's a complete U-turn from his successor. But then obviously, who cares about Biden because he's going to be gone in a few weeks, and it's going to be Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is coming to office with a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is an old school anti-Iran, anti-Assad hawk, and Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, probably the American politician most close to Bashar al-Assad, has gone to meet with him. What does the Trump administration do here, do you think, from January 20th onwards, if Syria is still on the boil as it is now?
So, yeah, I've been following the debates. I think all those contradictions, I don't think they're going to affect, affect the decision by Trump. I think Trump instinctively doesn't want to be involved in Syria. He doesn't want to be involved in the region. He's going to work with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Israel, to give them more autonomy in the region, and that's it. Turkey will be one of those. So I would imagine that Turkey will have a more say in Syria, mean more ability to maneuver in Syria, which means the Kurds are going to be losing. Assad regime is not going to be is going to face basically more pressure from Turkey. So I think these are kind of the general thing. People think of like the different names, but I think these are all different voices that Trump will listen to and then dismiss, and then he will go back to his view that, okay, Turkey, I like Turkey, I work with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and more pressure on Iran. I think there's going to be increased pressure against Iran more than before, not because he wants to topple the Iranian regime. It's precisely the opposite, because he wants to make peace with them, but a deal that's better than Obama's deal.
So a couple of last words from subscribers. Deborah Cooper points out that you seem to be shaking hands with the Pope in a picture over your left shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. A few years ago, met him in the.
Oh, well. And she recommends the movie Conclave, she says. And Oz Hack, you mentioned earlier, you said in the context of HTS, you said, they're not global jihad, etc. They're still bad people, right? They're people who kill and torture and etc. And that made me think about 2014, 15, 16, when I used to have a lot of these arguments about Syria, which is the tragedy for the Syrian people is that there are bad people across the board. Assad is bad, but if Jolani became the president of Syria, he's a bad guy as well. But there's a lot of ordinary Syrians who are not Jolani and not Assad, and who probably would want a democracy such as our own. Ozhak asks, is there any hope for the Syrian people?
Yeah, I think so. I'm hopeful. I think, look, I agree. The three rulers of Syria today, the people who, at the helm of three regions in Syria, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, Bashar al-Assad, and Mazloum Abdi, the Kurdish leader in eastern Syria. They're all either radicals or linked to radicals. Their army, like Iranian militias and so on and so forth, Assad regime. Mazloum Abdi is a veteran of the PKK, which is a designated organization by Turkey and the United States, but they work with them. The Taliban was a designated and an enemy for the Americans, but they work with them. I see hope only because I think, like politically speaking, like the way that Syria is divided now, I always people say I'm in favor of dividing Syria. It's not true. For example, I say I think the best way to unite Syria is to divide it first, meaning you allow these local governance to be entrenched in different parts of Syria, and then you have a sort of a Syria that's more decentralized, more you have local autonomy, something that Assad himself would accept in theory. So the Kurds would continue to exist in eastern Syria. They have been building governance. They are actually probably the best rulers in Syria if you compare, like relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Second to them is the Syrian rebels. Now, this is ironic because obviously they are a descendant of Al-Qaeda, but they have been a stabilizing force in northwestern Syria. That's not an endorsement, that's just an analysis. And the Assad regime is weak, is corrupt. It's probably the most corrupt of the three. So I see hope in the sense that as this continues and as these local structures stabilize, I think you will start to see different models in Syria that eventually will always stay as part of one Syria. And I think all three forces, the Kurds, the jihadists, if you want to call them, or the Islamists, and the Assad regime, all believe that Syria has to stay one. But that doesn't mean they don't have like local structures where they operate in different ways.
We'll have to leave it there. We like to end on a hope question. Thank you, Ozhak, for that question, because Zeteo is all about hope in these dark times. Syria is a big breaking story. Stay with Zeteo. We'll be bringing you more updates, more analysis. Hassan, thank you for your time. I know how busy you are and you're traveling to the region. We appreciate you taking time out for us and our paid subscribers today. Thank you all at home for watching and for being paid subscribers to Zeteo. Tell your friends and family to sign up too so we can do more of this stuff. We need your support as we get ready for 2025. Thank you for watching today. We'll be back with another Zeteo Town Hall very soon. Thanks. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.